now we'll we'll have a panel session on a bit more concrete issues that try to apply this kind of engaged philosophy way of doing philosophy to some concrete problems. So we have Bojana Radovanović from the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, and Teresa Valle. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, please do say that I'm not. So Bojana will talk about effective philanthropy, a case for engaged philosophy. I suggest that we do the same thing that we did yesterday. So first, you will present for about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll have a joint discussion about your work. So Bojana, I'm handing things over to you. If you have a PowerPoint presentation, you should have the share screen option. If not, let us know.
Thank you very much, Marko, and good morning to everyone. I'm really honored to be in such a great company today and yesterday. And as Marko said, my today's presentation will be on effective philanthropy. And this is the topic. The philanthropy is a topic which is currently my research interest within the recently established Laboratory for Philanthropy, Solidarity and Care Studies here at the Institute. And I will try to draw some ideas from my previous research interests and trainings in economics, development studies, and moral philosophy, and let's see whether it all makes sense together. So I will argue that effective philanthropy is an example of applied philosophy, but I will also argue that there is a case for approaching this issue from the perspective of engaged philosophy, particularly because there are currently many discussions both on the philosophical foundations of this approach and on its effects, societal effects, and the opinions are polarized. So firstly, I will present what the effective philanthropy means, so what are its main characteristics, and then I will try to apply engaged philosophy methodology as developed by Professor Wolf to this issue. Well, with the traditional philanthropy being criticized as ineffective and inefficient, there has been growing number of calls for philanthropy to renovate and become more effective. And such calls became particularly prominent since the global financial crisis of 2008. And then the new philanthropy emerged, the so-called effective philanthropy, which refers to new approaches to philanthropy that are dedicated to solving the world problems through marketized individuals' means and data-driven solutions with measurable outcomes. Two approaches to effective philanthropy are philanthropic capitalism and effective altruism, and we will look at both today. So the term philanthropic capitalism firstly appeared in the magazine Economist, that was developed by Bishop and further expanded in his book co-authored with Michael Green. The book is titled Philanthropic Capitalism, How the Rich Can Save the World and Why We Should Let Them. So the philanthropic capitalism in a nutshell means strategic application of market methods and motives for philanthropic purposes. It implies that capitalism can be philanthropic, encouraging innovation in a way that tends to benefit everyone. And just like the pioneers of political economy of 18th century and the so-called captains of industry of the 19th century, today's philanthropic capitalists share the belief that market solutions contribute to the well-being of the wider community. And also to do a good deed at the same time to do a good job is the key idea of philanthropic capitalism. And its main characteristic is this combination of making a profit with solving the world problems. And philanthropic capitalists are increasingly trying to find a way of harnessing the profit motive to achieve social good. And they are trying to save the world through large-scale metrics-driven programs in health, education, and other areas. And perhaps the philosophy behind philanthropic capitalism is the best explained in Bill Gates' speech given at the Harvard University to the Harvard graduates in 2007. So here Gates explains why he and his fiancée at the time, Melinda, are going into philanthropy. So for the Gates couple, the challenge was how can they do the most good for the greatest number with the resources they had. So during their discussion on this question, they read an article about the millions of children who are dying every year in poor countries from disease that they have long ago made harmless in the USA. So they asked themselves, how could the world let these children die? And the answer, as the Gates couple saw it, was in fact that markets did not reward saving the lives of these children, and governments did not subsidize it. So the children died because their mothers and fathers had no power in the market and no voice in the system. And then Gates says that if we, and we are obviously wealthy, privileged individuals, if we can find approaches that meet the needs of the poor in ways that generate profits for business and vote for politicians, we will have found a sustainable way to reduce inequality in the world. And it is worth noting that among the super rich individuals, there is this growing sense that giving is a responsibility. So philanthropy is not an option, it is a responsibility of wealth. And obviously this is not a new idea, it can be traced back to Christianity. And another belief that as problem solvers, entrepreneurs actually can do something. Another idea that is not pretty new, we can find it already in Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. So this growing sense that philanthropy is not an option, but responsibility of wealth is an interesting thing we can further discuss later. So while Bill Gates is perhaps the most well known for his philanthropy, he is not the only one among the super rich who are engaging in philanthropic endeavors. And in fact, since 2010, there has been a growing number of rich individuals coming together in a kind of movement titled Giving Pledge. And so they are publicly announcing and publicly committing themselves to give away a majority of their wealth to charitable causes and philanthropy, but not any cause and any philanthropy, but to large-scale, high-impact giving. This is one important issue to notice. While the Giving Pledge is for the chosen few, all of us could be effective altruists. So effective altruism is another form of effective philanthropy. And it is a philosophy and social movement focused on answering one question: how can we best help others? So it is argued that our resources are limited and that thus we have to use them wisely. Effective altruism is the project of using evidence and reason to find the most promising causes to work on. And it is taking action by using our time and money to do the most good. And the very ideas behind this philosophy are already explicated in its title. And there is a growing global community of people who organize significant parts of their lives around these two ideas. This growing community came together in a movement called Giving What We Can. The philosophical, Giving What We Can is community of effective givers, and it was initiated by two Oxford philosophers, Toby Ord and William MacAskill. And today there are more than 6,000 members who have pledged to donate at least 10% of their income over the course of their careers, and more than 1,000 others who have made other significant commitments. So they aim to create a culture where people are inspired to give more, and they believe that charities can make a significant change in the world, but not all charities and not all interventions, but only those that are the most effective. And therefore, this growing community is committed to donate to these most effective charities. And as it is already been said, the philanthropic capitalism and giving pledge is initiated by entrepreneurs, while effective altruism is based and is initiated by philosophers. The philosophical foundations of effective altruism can be found in Peter Singer's utilitarian theory, already explicated in his paper Famine, Affluence and Morality from 1972, and further developed in his book The Life You Can Save and the Most Good You Can Do. So Singer argues that people from affluent societies are morally obliged to donate to charities that provide aid to people living in extreme poverty in developing countries. And he supports this with the following argument. So he says that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care is bad. Then if it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, it is wrong not to do so. Then by donating to aid agencies, you can prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without sacrificing anything nearly as important. Therefore, if you do not donate to aid agencies, you are doing something wrong. So McCaskill, the co-founder of the effective altruism movement, argues that people living in affluent societies are comparatively so rich that the amount by which they can benefit others is much greater than the amount by which they can benefit themselves. And that's why we ought to donate to the most effective charities. So here the crucial is both to philanthropic capitalism and effective altruism is this assessment of effectiveness. And there are specialized organizations that provide such assessment. For example, organization called Giving Well is entirely devoted to assessing charities that help those in extreme poverty in terms of the additional benefits delivered for each extra dollar donated. So basically this organization is comparing various programs and trying to, based on the same indicator of how many lives this program or that intervention saves, or how much lives it improves. And based on this indicator, it makes a list of the most efficient charities. And thus it informs donors within this effective altruism movement. And the question is how we know which action, which intervention is the most effective. And this assessment is based on randomized controlled trials, which are more and more popular within development economics, but they are also very much criticized as well. So the randomized controlled trials are basically forms of impact evaluation in which the population receiving the program or policy intervention is chosen at random from the eligible population, such as people, schools, or villages. And the control group is also chosen at random from the same eligible population. And then it is tested the extent to which the planned impacts are being achieved. And based on such experiments, so the focus of such experiments was the use of bed nets in a fight against malaria, and multiple randomized controlled trials show that mass distribution of long-lasting bed nets reduces malaria fevers and prevents deaths from this disease. So these findings, together with the fact that buying a net is rather non-expensive, it's only $5, made this intervention of providing and distributing bed nets very popular among the organizations. And Against Malaria Foundation is listed for many, many years, is listed among the most effective charities, and also Gates Foundation in its program on malaria. Its program on malaria is based on, among other things, on this intervention as well. So it is already obvious that effective philanthropy is applying utilitarian principle of doing the most good for the greatest number. But I would argue that this approach should be looked upon from the perspective of engaged philosophy, because it is very much present in the public debate, and the opinions on whether about its philosophical foundations and also about its societal effects are polarized. So the question is, can and how we could apply the engaged philosophy methodology as developed by Professor Wolf to the issue of effective philanthropy. And as I mentioned, there are many issues related to effective philanthropy that deserve looking at from this perspective of engaged philosophy. Some of them is the relationship between big philanthropy and democracy, and whether big philanthropy is actually dangerous for democracy. Then another important issue is relationship between big philanthropy and inequalities. Then the question of responsibility of wealth versus responsible or ethical or even legal acquisition of wealth. Also, there are issues related to the very sector of philanthropic sector, such as, is there a place for market solution and effectiveness in philanthropy at all? And more fundamental questions of whether capitalism is and can be really philanthropic, and whether whether the combination of making a profit with solving social problems really should be taken together. But my question here is that is effective philanthropy really effective in poverty reduction? So this is the issue we could look at from the perspective of engaged philosophy. And then this kind of simple question also poses more other questions, because we can say that each term in this sentence is actually a contested concept. So what does it mean to be effective? The dictionary definition is being successful or achieving results, but in what ways? And whether in short run or long run. Then what is poverty? How do we measure it? On the level of individuals, there are various approaches, from basic needs approach, subjective well-being, capability approach. On the level of countries, then the percent of population living below poverty line, also some other economic indicators such as gross domestic product or human development index. So, but let us see what are the arguments in this debate on whether effective philanthropy is really effective. So if we look at those who are in favor of effective philanthropy, for example, we can see that in the past 10 years, effective altruism contributed around $100 million to Against Malaria Foundation, which is used for buying 50 million bed nets, protecting 90 million people, and saving 30,000 lives. Or, for example, thanks to bed nets and other measures, malaria deaths are down by 42% since 2000. On the other hand, the arguments are the following. So there are evidence that since the great focus on fighting disease such as malaria or HIV, there has been a heavy bias towards these diseases and relatively little interest into other diseases. And also, while the foreign aid has succeeded in reducing the number of worldwide malaria deaths, once this foreign aid retreats, there is an increase in the numbers of people infected by this disease. So at this one example can show that perhaps such interventions are they're not enough, they're not sustainable, or that is at best, and there are arguments that they might be even harmful for in some other areas. So I would go to one more fundamental question that already Bill Gates asks in his speech. So when he was looking at the and asking why in some children in some countries are dying from preventable disease, perhaps the question or the answer should be in the and while in other countries these diseases are not existent, so perhaps the answer is in the quality of health system. And perhaps the level of economic development is related to the level or the quality of the health system. So in rich countries, in developed countries, due to the well-developed healthcare and health systems, we do not have such disease. So perhaps the whole point and the whole question should be moved to answer the following question: how could poor countries become rich? So once they become more developed, it is plausible to conclude that such diseases would be eradicated. And then we are now actually in the field of political economy. And answer to this question from the perspective of currently dominant neoclassical school of economics would be that rich countries become rich because they followed the economic policies of free market and free trade, and they avoided the bad policies of infant industry protection, import restriction, regulation of foreign direct investment, state-owned enterprises, export subsidies. So the question is, are today most developed countries really follow the policies of free market and free trade? And the answer to this question, it is necessary to answer to this question, it is necessary to know the history, the economic history. The historical method as methodological approach to the study of economics implies that search for patterns that have been repeated throughout the history of development of different economies. And the economist who firstly applied this method is German economist Friedrich List. And this method is nowadays used in development economics by the so-called heterodox school of economics. So what List already in 19th century found is the following, and it is nowadays known as the argument of infant industry protection. So he, based on his research on the histories of economic development of the Britain and the United States, at the time the most developed economies, so List argued, in the presence of a developed country, a less developed country cannot develop new industries without state intervention, especially in the form of customs protection. In his view, free trade is effective and good only among countries at the same level of development. Otherwise, a less developed country loses from such trade. So I will stop here and ask the question. So if the cure for poverty for less developed countries is in their economic and social development, and if for this they need to apply policies such as, for example, infant industry protection, and restrict and refrain from policies such as free trade, free market, and today such policies are not available for them due to international trade and financial rules. So the question for engaged philosopher would be, what if the likely best solution is not possible under the circumstances? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bojana, for that very interesting presentation. So now I saw Abigail join. So now we'll hear from Abigail Moses from Durham University. She will talk about mundane movements, philosophy of action, and lived experiences of disability. So Abigail, if you have a PowerPoint, you should be able to see the share screen option.
I do not have a PowerPoint. I am traditional philosopher that is terrible with technology. So.
That's fine too. So I'm giving the microphone over to you.
Thank you. So my name's Abby. I'm at Durham University. I'm a PhD student in my third year, and I do my research on philosophy of action and disability and phenomenology of illness. So a lot of the time I like to reflect upon my own disability and look at the philosophy and see if my experiences are in the philosophy, like, can I relate to it? and this is the purpose of this talk. So the overarching question for my talk will be, how can the lived experiences of disabled people be used to address methodological biases in philosophy of action? So when I was doing my master's degree, I took a philosophy of action module, and one of the seminars was on skilled action. So philosophy of action focuses on an individual's bodily movements and how this relates to individual agency. A lot of people understand skilled action as the ability to cope smoothly and directly to challenges posed by the environment. Accounts of skilled action generally agree that these actions are constituted by either intention, implementation of goals, control, adjusting and modifying behaviour, or flexible responses to the environment. So after doing the readings, I noticed that accounts of skilled action and what skill involves did not relate to my life experiences. And as I read more accounts of skilled action, I could not find any that included and represented people with disabilities. So I started to think, well, surely there's a lot of skill involved in the everyday actions that I undertake as a disabled person. So when I first got my walking stick at the ripe old age of 23, it took me quite a while to navigate my environment. So using a stick involves coordinating movement of my right arm with my left leg. And I must navigate what could be described as a hostile environment. So how do I approach walking up a flight of stairs with my walking stick? Or a wet floor? How do I use my stick in a way that ensures that I do not slip? Or in the supermarket, how can I push my shopping trolley with one hand and use my walking stick with the other hand? So that got me thinking that surely these everyday mundane movements are skillful, and there's a lot that can be learned from these lived experiences. So when thinking back to the definition of skilled action, to me, this all sounds like a concept that could very easily be adapted to the experiences of disabled people. Although they cannot perform actions as they once did previously, or in the same ways that able-bodied people can, these individuals have their own unique methods of coping and acting skillfully in everyday circumstances. So when I'm pushing my shopping trolley with my walking stick in the other hand, I'm acting with intention, control. I'm responding flexibly to the challenges in my environment. There could be a child running in front of me. I have to stop. Which leads us to the problem. So why can my experiences not be included or represented in current accounts of skilled action? So there seems to be a wider assumption in philosophy of action that the lived body is a healthy body. The able-bodied assumption, as I refer to it, is a tendency for the literature to analyse a relatively small subclass of skilled actions, which happens to be individuals who are able-bodied. So when looking at skilled action, authors focus on what they believe to be the gold standard of skill. So authors use examples of expert divers, elite cricketers, competitive dancers, and experienced athletes. As a result, the literature provides us with a distorted picture of skilled action based on idealised people in highly controlled environments. I argue that this is an oversight as it fails to fully capture the phenomena of skilled action. As people with disabilities perform skilled actions in mundane circumstances. Consequently, philosophy of action fails to engage with real-world problems pertaining to skilled actions of disabled people. However, I think the problem runs deeper than just this assumption. I think it lies in a methodological biases of those writing in the field of philosophy of action. So I don't know how far these biases travel in the field of philosophy more generally, whether this is something that is present in other areas or not, or maybe wider in the field of philosophy of action, not just skilled action. This is something that I do hope to find out at some point. So the literature in philosophy of action tends to have a methodological bias towards the perfect or ideal as a way of gaining a deeper understanding into certain phenomena and conceptualizing problems relating to human experiences. So a consequence of this methodology means that cases that don't fit the norm, such as disability, often aren't under philosophical scrutiny. By focusing on perfection, it means we miss rich, nuanced philosophical discussion, which is derived from moments of imperfection or mundane movements. It also means that we miss the opportunity to make philosophy accessible. It should not just be available to those who are in a unique position to understand, or people who can relate to or feel represented by this narrow perception. So how do we tackle a methodological bias? I believe the answer lies in exploring the lived experiences of those with disabilities. Lived experiences is a term commonly used in phenomenology to capture the unique experiences of an individual and what knowledge we can gain from these subjective experiences. The knowledge gain has meaning for the individual, and to fully understand someone's experiences, we need to really delve into this meaning. So meaning is context dependent and life dependent. I mean, personally for me, I kind of just see this lived experience as more of an everyday attitude that I have. Like I try to adopt that into my worldview on a day-to-day basis. So say if I'm listening to what a friend tells me, I try to really think of their lived experiences and what effect something has on them. So in the context of skilled action, the lived experiences of disabilities can be a useful philosophical tool for reflecting upon human imperfection. Lines of inquiry could include things like delving into what happens when skill breaks down and what effect does this have on the agent, and how one can rebuild skill after skill has already broke down. So for example, me losing the ability to walk on my own is a breakdown of skill, but me learning to walk functionally again with a walking stick is rebuilding skill, but with a tool. So the stick is an extension of my body into the world. So I think how people adapt and build new skills is a rich area of study which should be explored. I think by constantly looking at perfection, we cannot expect to discover anything new. People are not all the same, so why should our accounts of skilled action all be the same? So I think instead the focus should be on gaining an engaged, real-world understanding of the lived experiences of people with disabilities. So the research aim should not be asked, what is disability, but rather what common features do disability experiences share? What philosophical value do these experiences hold? How can we practically apply the knowledge from these experiences to tackle real-world problems? I propose we move away from pure theorizing and take a needed step towards including lived experiences in our philosophical methodology, seeing it as a step towards the philosophy of reflexivity. Philosophy can be useful if we shift methodological focus. So I would like to propose a corrective methodology with space for empirical research. I mean, I don't have time to propose a full methodology right now, but I will say some things that I think it should include. So I think to create a corrective methodology, it seems like we would need to explore how methodological biases have occurred in the first place. So why has an able-bodied perspective become the norm in accounts of skilled action? There are issues central to philosophy which can help us understand why disability is neglected in the literature and why there is a lack of consideration of disabled perspectives. So when I spoke to some of the philosophers in the university, when I said I wanted to do practical research in a philosophy PhD, like they were absolutely terrified at the thought of me doing that. And somebody mentioned to me that I wouldn't be taken seriously as a philosopher and I would have no career at the end, and that would be it. So I think this shows that there is still this conception that we must put constraints on what philosophy is and how we practice it, and importantly, who we practice it for. So I will propose some ways in which we can do more empirical research. I mean, these are just suggestions that I've thought of. Like I'd love to hear from other people what research they have encountered or used. So one example is a descriptive case study with anecdotal evidence from someone with a disability. Then use this case study to analyse the individual's lived experiences. What characteristic features can we take away from this? Although this may be useful, I'm inclined to go for a research method that samples a large number of experiences. My worry is that we may be generalising about lived experiences based on one person or a small number of people's accounts of disability. So me personally, for my philosophy, I use my disability as a way of engaging with philosophical material and reflecting upon how it represents my experiences. But I do not infer from this that all disabled experiences will be the same as mine. So a different example is qualitative ethnography. So holding interviews or doing surveys with people with disabilities. An interpretive phenomenological approach may enable the researcher to explore lived experiences of a phenomena like skilled action, and allows the participant to recount their own narrative, whilst appreciating that social contexts are embedded within the fabric of that person's worldview. Another idea is holding focus groups with people with disabilities. So a way to do this could be sharing with them a philosophical methodology and an approach to a phenomena like skilled action. Then seeing if any of the group identify with these accounts and feel represented by them. And if not, what are the reasons for this? And what do they think would be a better approach to include them? So I'm hoping that the takeaway from my talk is that we should not settle for a philosophy that fails to consider and represent everyone. We should not just focus on the ideal or the perfect. And we should be thinking of new ways to make philosophy accessible and engaged, and just reconsider how we do philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. That was very interesting. That you raised some very interesting questions, but we'll see in the discussion if others have picked up on some things that I have. But before we go into the discussion, we'll hear from Teresa Valle from National University 3 de Febrero and La Punta University. I hope I pronounced everything correctly. Teresa will talk about environmental matters do matter. So, and Teresa, if you have a PowerPoint, feel free to share. If not, that's also fine. So the floor is all yours.
To begin with, my very special thanks to the university and congratulations also, because talking about engaged and applied philosophy is not that common, at least among us. And no doubt we, at this point in time as academics, we are definitely in a time when this must be studied and discussed. I wanted to begin with, I must appreciate especially that I'm the only non-European in the group. I'm quite honored by that. The evidence and consequences of climate change are becoming ever more obvious. Global institutions have published stark warnings about the bleak future of the planet if we carry on with business as usual. Despite that, many governments, business, and the media pay no attention to it. And I'm afraid some philosophical circles have largely ignored it. I'm talking especially about what's going on here. The entire world is enduring the consequences of COVID-19. Day after day, we learn about the number of people who have caught the virus and the number of deaths all over the world. However, very little is said about studies that unveil its causes and the deep connection between the pandemic and humans' attitude to nature. There was a very recently published book in Argentina, which deals with various areas connected to nature and common good. And it says that over the past 2 years, comments and analysis have focused on the consequences of COVID-19 on human welfare, things like the economy, social relationships, health systems, work conditions and education, and many others. Still, very little has been said and published about its underlying origin and causes. The editors, I'm quoting, in particular, the correlation between the lifestyle of current societies and nature. My intention in this paper is to focus on, one, the rights in connection with the environment, and I'll talk about the notion of responsibility and testimonial injustice. Second, rights and responsibility in general. And third, local, rural, and indigenous communities and future generations. The first one, rights in connection with environment, the notion of responsibility. Most people will acknowledge self-assumed obligations, such as those owed to family and kin. We have special responsibilities to those who are dependent on us and vulnerable to our actions and choices, for example, our own children. When I say choices, I mean whether we do something or we don't. That means acts and omissions. So is responsibility toward our own country and fellow citizens, but definitely that is not all. When discussing the situation the whole world is currently facing as regards immediate future, Robert Gooding in 1985 provides a very interesting approach. I think it may contribute to respond to the urgent challenge the entire world is facing at the moment. He posits that both in the individual and the social level, we hold some degree of responsibility toward those who are vulnerable to our actions and choices. He calls it responsibility for vulnerability. His vulnerability model stresses the duties to aid those in special need. From the point of view of ethics, it is crucial to note that it stresses not only their special need, but also our special capacity to help. This means that our fundamental moral duties are based on dependency and vulnerability of others and our capacity to make a difference rather than on mere voluntary acts of will. This, of course, is connected to what the first speaker said. Along a similar line, Iris Marion Young in 2006 posits her social conception model of responsibility. She says that social processes that connect people create duties of justice. Some of these processes are structural. Structural social injustice harms people. She states that all those who contribute by their actions to structural processes that cause injustice have a responsibility to work towards solving such injustice. As opposed to the attribution of guilt or fault, as in the liability model, which is backward-looking, her model is basically forward-looking. In order to make the outcome of structural processes less unjust, one has an obligation to join with others who share that responsibility in order to achieve that goal for the common good. I suggest that it is not only our actions that matter, also our choices, including the choice of doing or saying nothing in the face of potentially dangerous decisions. Those people contribute to the dire consequences of climate change and a total disregard for nature. And I'm going to give an example of the southern region of Latin America. We have the largest area in the world sown with transgenic glyphosate-resistant soy. It covers 54 million hectares between Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and the south of Bolivia. Some 550 million liters of glyphosate are sprayed per year with the sanitary consequences that you cannot even dream of. 550 million liters. Some of the consequences are the extensive use of poisonous products damages people's health and poisons water courses. Thousands of farmers and local communities have been impoverished or blatantly displaced. They have to leave the places where they live. And of course, they come to very poor neighborhoods close to large cities. Thousands of small farmers who produced vegetables and fruit and sold it had to abandon their production because of the consequences of toxic products sprayed all over the area, damaging their production. In order to increase the areas devoted to this, in what we call industrial agriculture, millions of hectares of native forests were destroyed. Illness and deaths in rural communities multiplied. It's interesting because there's a movement, it's opposed by a new movement called the Group of Sprayed Towns. Concerned scientists have described it as an open sky laboratory. This dismal scenario is compounded by open mining, intensely opposed by local communities and indigenous groups whose rights were and still are ignored. And added to this, as if this were not enough, we have open sea fishing by international vessels, most of them illegal. Industrial agriculture and open mining have been causing havoc on what we call the 3 H's: habitats, inhabitants, and co-inhabitants. We refer to other than human inhabitants. The large area of forests that have disappeared and have been used for monoculture or mining cause loss of biodiversity and obviously disrupt ecosystems. Basic human rights to life, health, subsistence, and protection against displacement are ignored. In most cases, national and local authorities, technicians, professionals, business, and international companies disregard those rights. The main media do not mention it. They do regularly publish detailed news and information about the increase in harvests and exports. Many scientists, unfortunately, back this style of agriculture and mining. They highlight its advantages and they say absolutely nothing about its negative consequences. This is strongly reminiscent of what Proctor and Schebinger termed agnotology, the making and unmaking of ignorance, in 2008. Fortunately, things are gradually changing. A larger number of citizens, members of the academia, researchers, and scientists are actively opposing these practices and policies. Local communities are questioning and opposing projects launched by local authorities that damage their health and the environment, as well as disregarding the rights of future generations. It's interesting, a short time ago, we had the industrial salmon industry banned in the southernmost province of our country, Tierra del Fuego. That was a great step forward, owed in almost 100% to the local communities. A few local governments have taken note, as this is the case, and sanctioned laws forbidding the use of pesticides close to towns, cities, and rural schools. I'm afraid they are not always complied with, but the regulations are there. And so this brings us to the second perspective I mentioned, which is testimonial injustice. Miranda Fricker, who was mentioned yesterday, states that it is an epistemic kind of injustice and explores 2 forms of it, testimonial and hermeneutical. Both refer to a wrong done to someone in their capacity as a knower. Testimonial injustice, she says, occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker, to speaker's word, of course. Epistemic practices are socially situated. Participants stand in relation of social power to each other. Those relations allow some to control the actions of others. There is an identity prejudice, which is a constitutive component of epistemic injustice, especially of testimonial injustice. It is prevalent within a given society and its social relationships. It causes the hearer to give less credibility to the speaker because of his status in society. Prejudice against people as social types causes the hearer, it may be individuals, groups, government officials, doctors, teachers, whatever, to pay less attention or grant less credibility to the speaker or speakers. It may be the case that based on the same evidence, the testimony of an agronomist will receive more credibility than the testimony of a small farmer. You'll be surprised I talk a lot about farming because farming is a very large industry in our country. In the case of the issues we are discussing here, connected to agricultural practices and mining and common environmental goods in general, local and rural communities, as well as indigenous groups, will receive less credibility or will not even be informed and consulted about policies connected to their environment and their way of life. It is worth mentioning that such information and consultation are mandatory in many countries. Fricker defines this as an identity prejudicial credibility deficit. This identity power is present actively or passively whenever there are shared imaginative conceptions of social identity. And it operates at the level of the collective social imagination, the level of shared conceptions of social identity. This may be adequate or unfair, but it is involuntary. If the stereotype implies a prejudice against a speaker or a particular community, the hearer pays no attention to the speaker or community. This may cause him not to perceive or value, and this is important, or value the speaker's knowledge, and wrong him specifically in his capacity as a knower, and miss the great advantages of the knowledge of these people who, for example, have been carrying on their activity, especially in agriculture, for centuries with great success. In my opinion, this is the case with local, rural, and indigenous communities. Their knowledge and methods are simply ignored by governments and business, as well as by many scientists and citizens. And I'm sorry to add that academics are included here from philosophy. Now, my second point was rights and responsibility. There is a very interesting book written by Thomas Pogge in 2002, World Poverty and Human Rights. He said that the new global economic order established by the World Trade Organization Treaty was harsh on the poor. Now, what I find particularly interesting is that he did not dwell on the different issues discussed and examined and established in the treaty. Instead, he focused on the negotiations procedure. The details of the new order, he said, are fixed in international negotiations in which the governments of rich and developed countries have a crushing advantage simply in bargaining power and expertise. And he added something that I wish to connect with what we have seen about responsibility and testimonial injustice. He says the representatives of those countries in international negotiations do not consider the interests of the global poor as part of their mandate. Their focus and mandate are to shape agreements in the best interest of the people and corporations of their own country. Now, Pogge rates this as an exploitation by the representatives of their bargaining power and expertise, including the lawyers that they take to these negotiations. Compounded, he adds, with realism, he adds with great realism, by the eventual ignorance on corruptibility of negotiators from underdeveloped countries. On the one hand, the interests, needs, knowledge, lifestyle of citizens of poor countries are not considered. This is connected to testimonial injustice. There is absolutely no doubt that the social power of the representatives of affluent countries is notoriously greater than the social power of representatives of less developed countries. Social power allows agents to influence what and how things happen in those negotiations and in the social world at large. Fricker terms it identity power. There is a social group that exercises power on other social groups, and that spells social control, which in turn creates or preserves a particular social order. On the other hand, in view of the notion of social responsibility connected to vulnerability, it is not only governments and the representatives who may be called into account for the unfair economic order and the unsustainable environmental situation the entire world is facing at present and will increasingly face in the future. Citizens also share part of such responsibility. Poge's reading of current global economic arrangements imposed by affluent governments goes beyond those governments. He writes, quote, "Deaths caused by global economic arrangements designed and imposed by our governments are a different matter. These governments are elected by us," says Poge. These governments are elected by us. They are responsive to our interests and preferences, and they act in our name and in ways that benefits us. I think that's food for thought. It is true that we cannot ignore the incompetence and corruption of rulers and elites in some developing countries. As I come from one of them, I wouldn't dream of denying that. We know corruption very well. But as Poge asks, and this is an interesting question, can the poor in those countries be told that they only have their own leaders to blame for it? The people in those countries can well reply that their leaders can flout the welfare of their own people only because, I'm quoting Poge, developed countries treat those leaders as entitled to consent in behalf of the people they manage to subjugate. Or, as the saying goes in my country, it takes two for tango. This brings us back to the notion of responsibility for our actions, choices, and omissions that we discussed earlier. And my third point are the local, rural, and indigenous communities and future generations. We've said before that much has been said about the consequences of COVID-19. Actually, I'm afraid to say, scientists have warned that the next new pandemic is not too far away. Analysis about its origin and causes are scarce. Information on and discussion of its connection with lifestyles, agricultural and cattle raising methods, deforestation, the food we consume, means of transportation, none have been discussed, let alone questioned. This is closely related to the disconnection and lack of concern for the environment and its inhabitants, our co-inhabitants, in fact. I'm talking about biodiversity, which naturally turns us indifferent toward the consequence of that lack of connection and our unwillingness to acknowledge our responsibility for the damage done to the 3 H's. I remind you, habitat, inhabitants, and co-inhabitants, by such lack of concern for them. Lastly, we may connect what we have been discussing with the case of indigenous communities, local and rural communities, and future generations. No attention is granted to the rights to a healthy environment and common goods. This is compounded by disregarding their knowledge and ways of life that, as I said before, have guaranteed their subsistence up to now. They have no access to information about projects that are detrimental to their way of life. Now, this is surprising because it implies ignoring some global treatises and declarations. I will only mention a few. First, Point one, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development in 1992. Principle 21 refers to youth. And it says, the creativity, ideals, and courage of the youth of the world should be mobilized to forge a global partnership in order to achieve sustainable development and ensure a better future for all. That's principle 21. Principle 22 talks about indigenous people. It says that these people and their communities and other local communities have a vital role in environmental management and development, precisely because of the knowledge and traditional practices. And it says, states should recognize and duly support their identity, culture, and interests, and enable their effective participation in the achievement of sustainable development. As far as the right to information and participation, Principle 10 is crystal clear about it. It says environmental issues are best handled with the participation of all concerned citizens. Each individual shall have appropriate access to information concerning the environment that is held by public authorities, including information on hazardous materials and activities in their own communities, and the opportunity to participate in decision-making processes. Participate in decision-making processes. The second treaty I would like to mention is the Escazú Agreement. Escazú is a town in Costa Rica, and an agreement was signed this year, 2021. It was signed and ratified by 33 Latin American countries. It is a regional agreement on access to information, public participation, and access to justice in precisely environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. It highlights the need to create and strengthen capacities and cooperation in order to protect the right of current and future generations to live in a healthy environment and its sustainable development. It also agrees to guarantee access to justice in environmental matters and to establish the necessary tools to protect people who advocate the defense of the environment. I want to add also that lately, the constitutions of several countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have included regulations focused on environmental protection. Maybe some of you have heard about the most overreaching one is the Constitution of Ecuador that highlights what they call sumac causai. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it properly. It means good living as the core of concern and policies focused on the protection of the environment. So summing up, we talked about that the context of the suggestions that philosophy should be more engaged in crucial issues of our time. We have focused on environmental issues. We discussed the notions of responsibility and testimonial injustice in connection to the environment. And then we worked on a wider notion of responsibility and focused on the issue of rights and justice in connection with local, rural, and indigenous communities. And to conclude, I would like to quote a passage of the letter that was very short time ago, addressed to the president of Argentina by young people in a place called Andalgalá. This is a town in the province of Catamarca, Argentina, that's in the north of the country. It refers to open mining activities that are poisoning the water sources of what we call the Nevado de la Conquija Hills. A Conquija is a mountain. It covers the provinces of Catamarca and neighboring Tucumán. The point I wish to stress is that these young people wisely synthesize much of what I have tried to argue in this presentation. I'm quoting, the reasons why the young people say, the reasons why we oppose this mega mining project are numerous. And we as girls, boys, teenagers, and young people were never consulted about it. Our opinion about this exploitation was never asked. and we will be the ones to suffer the worst impact. We will be the ones to suffer the worst impact of the pollution this mega mining will cause should the project be carried on. And in total conclusion, I am quoting Bob Dylan and Tom Petty. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. Thank you for your attention. My dog thinks it's time to finish.
Thank you, Teresa. That was super interesting, and at least I learned and heard a lot of information that I didn't know. So we're also happy to have some non-European person to tell us what else is going on in the rest of the world, because the world is not just obviously Europe and North America. There are other places. And thank you all three for your presentations. I think that it was all three showed how an engaged philosophy works in action, so to say. So how we can think about some issues in an engaged way. So now I'll open the floor for discussion. If anyone has questions or comments for one of our or all of our presenters. Joe, go ahead.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry, I was in and out this morning, so I didn't hear all of the presentations. So apologies if my question was already dealt with in the talk. But I've got a question for Abigail about the methodology. And I completely applaud the idea of listening to the experiences of people with disabilities. What I wondered is whether you felt the sort of existing work, because there's an awful lot of material of this sort in disability studies and sociology of disability, whether that work was in some ways inadequate, whether there's something special a philosopher would do in this work, because, and of course there is work by people like Javi Carrel on illness. Many philosophers who write about disability, like Shelley Tremaine, for example, are themselves disabled and writing from their own experience. So I think it's just a question for me of what do you find lacking in the existing literature, and whether there's something that you would like to add to it. Thank you. You're on mute, Abigail.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I have read most of Javi Carrel's work and spoken with her quite a bit. And I think it's not that the existing stuff isn't good enough. I think it's more that there isn't enough of it. And I think Javi herself has written a lot of work on that we need a kind of different methodology. And that's something she's written papers on, but has never gone as far to like present a different methodology. Well, she does have her accounts of illness, but I think it's more like widespread in philosophy is the aim.
Okay, so I do understand that, but Javi is not the only person who's been writing, and yes. So Shelley Tremaine, for example, yeah. Foucault and feminist philosophy of disability. Okay, so well, I don't know if you want to comment on that work. Oh.
Yeah, I think what Shelley Tremaine does is really good. I think for me in particular, what I was wanting to do is include more experiences in what we do. I mean, my work in particular, I do a lot of philosophy of illness, like Javi Carrel does, but my work in particular, I focus on chronic illness.
Right.
Because that's something that hasn't been explored very much. So that element of chronic, what is it that makes those types of illnesses different from other illnesses? Because they change over time. there's periods of flare-ups, things like that, I think have a lot of philosophical value. There is a lot of work on disability, but again, I think we should be adapting philosophy in a way that we shouldn't have to have a separate, well, here's disability studies or philosophy of disability, and then here's normal philosophy. Like, why can we not have accounts that do both?
Yeah, that's very good. So I like that. And there's two dangers that, as you were talking, that you're going to avoid, but I think it is just worth reflecting on them. And one of them is using one form of illness or disability as a paradigm for all forms. And very often it's physical disability. And as you know, the international sign of disability is someone sitting in a wheelchair, or a graphic representation, as if that's what disability is.
Wheelchair basketball is frequently mentioned. Like when we look at skill, if you're disabled in your skill, you're in a wheelchair playing basketball. Every other type of disability, you know, something as simple as like walking in the supermarket, that's not skill. Everyone should be achieving. Basketball, it sets the standard too high for people.
And so we agree on that, and we agree on the other thing, I think, which is that in philosophy and in real life, disability is very often treated as an afterthought. So you get things right for the majority, and then you turn to disability. And one of the things I've been thinking about in my own work about disability is, how would our theories of justice be different if we started from the recognition that a significant number of people suffer a whole range of disabilities. And similarly, you can use that starting question for thinking about town design or university design or curriculum design. Now, how would we do things differently if we tried to start with this inclusive perspective rather than the mainstream first and disability after? I'm not saying anything you don't agree with. I'm sure it's just a thought that came to me as you were talking. So thank you.
I think as well, like, I've done a lot of research into adaptive aids, which I think is something that is really interesting. Like maybe like an ecological psychology perspective on adaptive aids, how we engage with the environment through the adaptive aid, like a walking stick or a wheelchair. I think that's something that would be definitely worth exploring.
Christoph, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Marko. Hi, everybody. I have a question for Bojana. I found your presentation really good, so thank you very much. That was fascinating. I have a question about, probably unsurprisingly, George Soros. And I have to ask about him because, as you might know, the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory has just joined the Open Society University Network. And I think the case is very interesting of Soros because before I came to CEU, I didn't know much about him. Because I was living in Scotland, because I was based at the University of St. Andrews. But then I joined CEU, and I was really shocked, by the vitriolic comments and by all the hatred that he seems to experience. And I wondered, so my first question is, does George Soros play any role in your research at all? And secondly, and more broadly and more generally, how are you dealing with these criticisms that come mainly from the political right, I would say, but also to some degrees from the political left, these criticisms that they have for philanthropists in general? So how are you dealing with these criticisms in your research?
Thank you very much, Christoph. So I didn't specifically focus on the work that George Soros did, but your question actually has one important implication. So if we agree that somebody's work, and for example, this in building global civil society around the world is a good aim. So if we think that having strong civil society organizations is good, so it is good for democracy. And then on the other hand, we have this figure who has enormous wealth and using this enormous wealth for this purpose. Should we say that this is a good thing from the perspective of democracy? So in a way, he is monopolizing a vision of the common good, of a vision of a public good, because he has such an enormous capacity to influence its creation. So, and this is the debate in the current debate on the relationship between big philanthropy and democracy. So the issue is, even when it is good, and even if we agree with the results or with the aims, is it still, let's say, appropriate? Is it still justifiable to have such an enormous influence on the whole society or on different countries? So my own position, I'm not sure, so I don't know what to say, whether in which camp I am, but I think it's, for engaged philosophy, it's important to have these both sides. And that's, I believe we need engaged philosophy to look at the the different issues within effective philanthropy. So thank you.
Thank you.
And Teresa, go ahead. So you're still on mute, so.
This is a question for Bojana. It was very, very interesting to listen to you, but I would like to know if there is a proviso in all these aid projects about the activities carried out by the business run by these people who have lots of money that they can help with. Connected to what I've been saying, much of the deforestation and industrial agriculture and mining and so on, and fishing, is carried out by international companies. So I would like to know if that is also considered when they talk about aid, because maybe they are helping people, investing money to solve illnesses caused by their own industries.
Thank you very much. This is another very important issue, and there are debates around this question of, as I said, philanthropic capitalism has this, the main idea, let's say, behind philanthropic capitalism is that it combines profit motive with solving world problems. And for philanthropic capitalists, there is no problem with this. So they're trying to make capitalism more creative, so that market forces can reach the problems of poor people. But the opponents of such approach are basically stating the things that you just said. So this business is actually gaining more than what the good they are trying to do. So, and sometimes their actions are actually just to make more money and to have a better image for their companies. So yes, there is this debate of how, and is it at all possible to combine profit motive with solving world problems. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't oppose them. I'm just asking because I think it should be essential. I mean, it should be part of the, all right, you help, but wait a minute. Are you part of the cause of those illnesses or problems or so on?
And not only are they often or sometimes part of the cause, but they are earning money through the ways they are helping. And this is another issue that I believe should be addressed from the engaged philosophy perspective.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
I have a question for Maria Teresa. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
I was thinking when you were speaking that mine and your talks were quite similar. Like, I was wondering if you find that there is a methodological bias in environmental philosophy.
Probably. It all depends on who does it. Mm-hmm. Actually, there are very few people who do environmental philosophy in our country. It's just to tell you, this association, a philosophical association I belong to, organizes a colloquium every year. This is the first year including something connected to environmental philosophy, because 2 years ago, I started a research group in that association on environmental philosophy and applied ethics. And this is the first time that they have this colloquium. It is not something we talk about. I mean, there are many groups that are working actively in defense of the environment, but not from the philosophical stance.
Yeah, do you find that, I know there's environmental accounts that take into account how we treat women and how we treat environment. Is the same like similar accounts with disability? I haven't done much research into environment, so I don't know.
No, when it comes to the way women are treated, there has been great progress in our country. There have been new laws and regulations, and things have changed. That doesn't mean that domestic violence is a very big issue here. It's terrible. And there's one thing about closing schools. They have been closed for the whole of last year, and they have only opened now. Domestic violence with women and children, it was easier when children went to school, there was something wrong with them, the teacher started asking, and it all came out. Now they couldn't talk to anyone. So in our country, at least, 75% of domestic violence is, or raping children and all the sexual assault and all that, 75% is done within the family. So things, I mean, the situation is dreadful, but there is great focus on that, much more than on the environment.
Thank you.
Bojana, go ahead.
Thank you for your question.
The question that Abigail just raised remind me of something that I have been thinking since yesterday's lecture. So it is about this, the fact that engaged philosophy shouldn't just apply certain theories to world problems and say that if I am a Kantian, then this would be a Kantian position, or if I am utilitarian, this would be a utilitarian position. And my question is how, so certainly all of us have have theories that are close to our hearts, let's say, and then how we manage to be open to others. For example, here in my presentation at the end, I quoted from heterodox economics, and this is where I am trained in, and this is the school that I think is the best to answer this question. But if you ask some other economists, you would certainly gain other, let's say, other answers, and both would be based on some data. There are data for everything. So how we avoid confirmation bias in doing engaged philosophy? I mean, it's a question for all of us.
I don't know if that's a question for me from yesterday, but it is a great question. And I just saw a tweet yesterday where someone said, of the 50 cognitive biases we know, 49 of them are trivial, and one of them is destroying the world, and that's confirmation bias. And I see this in the debate in the UK around the effects of immigration during the Brexit debate. You can absolutely find a study a highly regarded, peer-reviewed study that would support any view you wanted. And so this idea of supporting your position with evidence, I think, is very, very dangerous because you cherry pick evidence. So for me, the starting point is if you're working in a different field, if you're trying to work across fields, the first thing to keep in mind is the field you're looking in is going to be as controversial as your own field. So we laugh when someone comes in from economics and reads Karl Popper and thinks they know all about philosophy of science. They've read one thing, which is very prominent. Or if they go to if you go to the latest, suppose you were not a philosopher and you thought, I want to find out what philosophers think about something, and you went to Philosophy and Public Affairs and read the first article, I thought, now I know what philosophers think about it. We'd laugh at them because that's one position in a debate. So I think the only way in is through people rather than journals. And when I've been working on committees, I've been very impressed in the way in which the difference between the way academics approach a topic and journalists approach a topic. Because if we want to know something, in the old days, we'd bury ourselves in a library and read for a month, or we would go to Google Scholar. What a journalist does is a Google search to find out who the 5 experts are and phone them all up. And then you find out what's considered a settled issue in a field, what's a live issue in a field, where the debate is. Now, of course, your question wasn't about finding diversity, it was about how to settle it once you've found it. And that is a real problem. But all you can do is look at the arguments, see what seems to work, see what people you respect feel. But I had this when I was working on global health, and there were 2 teams looking at what had caused the falling life expectancy in Russia after the end of communism. And they were both looking at the same data, and they were both teams that I regarded as highly respectable, and they came to completely different conclusions. And I realized I just have no way of adjudicating this. I'm going to have to wait for 10 years to find out what the statisticians think. But you have to live with this sort of uncertainty. But I don't know if any of that helps or just makes it worse for you.
Now I'll use my great power as a moderator to ask some questions. So one is for Bojana. So Bojana and I both are interested in and work together on the capabilities approach. So my question will be connected to that. So when you were talking about philanthropy and you mentioned the example of Bill Gates and we have some responsibility to give to some effective charities, and then you mentioned, well, once this aid stops, I think it was connected to malaria, we see an increase. So what occurred to me is, well, but for those of you who don't, so Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have this theory of the capabilities approach. So what matters is our human capabilities, what we are able to do and to be. And I thought, well, so in their writing, even Sen, when he discusses famine in India, if I remember correctly, he says, well, it's not enough to just feed the people. We need to teach people how to produce their own food so that in the long run, they will have the capability not to starve from death. And so it occurred to me, would that be useful to think about philanthropy in a way that it's not just giving some material resources, but actually focusing on educating people so that they have certain important capabilities? Would that be a better way to think about what philanthropy is? And I'll ask one more question for Teresa and then let you respond. So in your presentation, it was quite rich and very interesting, and so I'll limit myself to just one thing that kind of stuck with me, and this is the notion of responsibility and whether citizens are implicated or even essentially responsible for what their government does. And Poge, as far as I remember correctly, when he discusses about world poverty, he does claim that people in poor countries. So the poor have a responsibility for participating in a bad global economic system that causes their poverty. And that kind of strikes me as a bit harsh to place so much moral responsibility on poor people when in a way they are willingly participating in a unjust global economic system. But on the other hand, they're not willingly participating precisely because they are in a disadvantaged position. It seems to me that we can think of their participation as involuntary, in the sense that their alternatives are just crazy to say, no, what would be the alternative? Just to get out and refuse to participate in an unjust economic system? Well, if they do that, then they would be even more poor and suffer even more and be even more disadvantaged. So how do we assign responsibility? Does assigning responsibility depend on our position in the socioeconomic structure? So that's my question. I'll let you answer or comment whether my comments and questions make sense.
Well, that's exactly what happens. We are in the horns of a dilemma, we would say in logic. Yes, the point is that you can't pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist, but at the same time, point one, in countries like ours, corruption among government, especially the current government, is absolutely incredible. You wouldn't believe it. So they would be.
Ours is probably even more corrupt.
Yes. Yesterday, the group who talked said that what had happened with elections and how suddenly COVID disappeared because elections were coming. And I wrote a message in private to him saying, well, then our government copied yours, because that's exactly what our government did. The point is that what Pogge says, this is not I who says it, what Thomas Pogge says is, in a way, citizens of wealthy countries are also responsible for those negotiations, because it's their people. Of course, their negotiators want to get the best deal for the country they are representing. But what Pogge insists is that citizens from those countries should also be very careful to not accept any deal that will really cause great trouble to other countries. Now, that's obviously easily said, but it's very difficult to put into action. In fact, some years ago, several poor countries, especially in Africa, got together and they asked Oxfam to represent them in those negotiations because they had better lawyers and advocates, because they just couldn't. They couldn't negotiate with people who were such great specialists. Now, can we come out of that? That's very difficult. We are in a particular crisis in our country at this moment, so we find it very difficult to realize that we have to join the world, because we can't be left just stay out, and the world is not going to just please us in everything we need. So yes, this is a dilemma, not only for us, for all the good thing, and I'm very optimistic, I must say, but the good thing about it is that more and more citizens and scientists are getting aware and fighting it out. I mean, this group of sprayed towns is headed by a doctor from a university in Rosario, and several other academics are becoming more and more engaged. So what Proctor says in agnotology is sort of slowing down a bit here, and many scientists are voicing out their opposition. What I mentioned about the red salmon fisheries, which were banned, was the main actors were scientists, believe it or not, owners of restaurants, and social workers. The owners of restaurants had a very important role, because when they said to their customers, no, we don't sell red salmon, people said, why not? And they explained it. And more people realized that they shouldn't eat or buy red salmon. And that made an enormous difference. Now, without information from science, they would have done nothing. So we are working, things are really getting much better in that sense. I don't know if I managed to answer your question.
Thank you very much, Marko, for this very important question of what is true philanthropy. That is a big question that I am thinking about as I'm now interested in this history of philanthropy. And if we look at the very term, so philanthropy means from the love of mankind. And if we go back to its very first usage, it is to describe Prometheus, who gave fire to people, and then who was, for this deed, he was punished. So he did something really great for humankind. And then this term was neglected and then reinvented with the Enlightenment, and then it was used for activities that were meant to bring huge change in the society, to bring to bring change that would benefit all the people. So the question, and then again, there was always new waves of philanthropy and changes in it with the aim to better, let's say, solve the world problems. But then today, philanthropy is mostly connected with the philanthropic sector and with the work of philanthropy organizations and foundations. And the question is whether this work is really what will help poor countries to go out from the poverty, and whether real philanthropy, as you suggested, would be something else. And to be fair, for example, Gates Foundation, who in their global health programs previously was focused mostly on vaccines and this in malaria programs on bed nets, they were increasingly aware and increasingly focusing on building healthcare systems. So there is a need for systemic change. So I believe that true philanthropy would be helping poor countries to get out of the poverty and to develop so that they can solve the current problems they're facing. Of course, the big question is how, and this is where the whole problem lies. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? If not, then we will end a bit earlier than planned and have a slightly longer break for lunch and then a bit of rest before we continue at 1:30 Central European time. We'll have a panel discussion in which we will attempt, Hannah and I will attempt to kind of round all these very interesting presentations that we had so far. So we'll have a panel discussion with our colleagues from the University of Rijeka, and we will talk about whether engaged philosophy is real philosophy. So some questions that were raised yesterday and today will be touched upon. That's why I didn't want to ask them now, because I was saving them for our panelists to see what exactly do we mean when we do philosophy, what makes philosophy real, and what distinguishes it from other disciplines. So I hope you will all join us for the panel discussion again at 1:30 Belgrade time, and the Zoom link will be the same. So enjoy your lunch break, and see you in a bit more than an hour. So thank you everyone again for all the great presentations and the comments and the questions, and see you soon.
Thank you very much.